The dust of Redemption, Colorado tasted of grit and failed prayers. It settled on everything: the sweat-stained brims of hats, the weary shoulders of draft horses, and the silent hopes of men who came west seeking fortune, and found only a harder version of the life they'd left behind. On this particular Tuesday, a day so bright and hot, the sky seemed a sheet of hammered brass, and the dust also tasted of gunpowder and fear. Samuel Cross felt it coat his tongue as he knelt behind an overturned water trough, the rough-hewn wood digging into his knee. The air, thick with the percussive blasts of gunfire, was a maelstrom of kicked-up earth and panicked screams. Moments ago, he had been buying flour at Miller's General Store, his mind a quiet, desolate landscape of its own. Now that landscape was ablaze. 4 riders had descended on the town like a plague of locusts, their faces masked by bandanas, their movements practiced and brutal. They'd hit the Redemption Bank and Trust with the force of a flash flood, a brazen daytime robbery that had caught the town entirely off guard. Sheriff Thompson was pinned down across the street, his lone deputy clutching a bloody arm behind the assayer's office. The townsfolk who hadn't fled were frozen, trapped in doorways, or cowering behind wagons. Samuel, however, was not frozen. He was coiled. A part of him he had buried a decade ago under layers of grief and self-imposed exile was stirring a cold, familiar burn in his gut. The instincts of U.S. Marshal Samuel Cross, long dormant, were waking up. He tracked the robbers' movements with an economy of motion, his eyes cataloging their positions, their weapons, their discipline. They weren't common thugs. They were professionals. The leader stood on the bank's porch, a tall man, whose confidence was a weapon in itself. He surveyed the chaos with an unnerving calm, his eyes the only part of his face visible above the dark bandana, as cold and empty as a winter sky. In his hand, he held a pistol that caught the merciless sun, its handle inlaid with gleaming silver. The sight of it sent a phantom ache through Samuel's soul, a whisper of a memory he fought to keep chained. A woman, Mrs. Gable. The banker's wife stumbled from the bank, her hands held high, her face a mask of terror. A sob escaped her lips as one of the robbers shoved her forward. The leader stopped her with a raised hand, his cold gaze drifting down to the delicate silver chain around her neck. From it hung a locket, a small, simple oval of polished silver. "That's a pretty thing." The leader's voice rasped, low and steady, yet it carried over the sporadic gunfire with chilling clarity. Mrs. Gable shook her head, tears streaming through the dust on her cheeks. "Please." It was my mother's. The leader showed no flicker of pity. With a swift, cruel motion, he reached out and ripped the locket from her throat. The chain snapped. Mrs. Gable cried out a sound of profound violation as the man turned the locket over in his gloved palm, examining it as if it were nothing more than a curiosity. Samuel went rigid. His breath caught in his chest, a knot of ice and fire. He could see the locket from his position, its silver surface flashing in the sun. It was an oval etched with a single climbing rose. Identical. The world around him dissolved into a roar of blood in his ears. The dust, the gunfire, the screaming townsfolk, it all faded away, replaced by the ghost of another sun-drenched afternoon, a decade gone, but seared into his memory like a brand. He saw his wife Sarah, her smile as bright as the field of sunflowers they stood in. He saw the locket at her throat, the one he had given her on their first anniversary, its silver warm from her skin. He saw the dust kicked up by another gang of riders, heard their laughter cruel and sharp. He saw the leader of that gang, a man they called a ghost, rip that same locket from Sarah's neck just before. He squeezed his eyes shut, the memory, a physical blow. He had been a marshal, then the best in the territory. He had hunted that gang, the Black Creek Raiders, for months. He had been closing in, but they found his home first. They took everything from him, his wife, his unborn child, his future. And they had taken that locket. The gang had scattered to the winds, after that their leader vanishing as if he'd never existed. Samuel had hunted for another year, a hollowed-out man driven by a rage so pure it burned away everything else, but he never found them. He never found him. The failure had shattered him. He had taken off his badge, turned his back on the law, and retreated into a solitary penance, convinced he was no longer worthy of protecting anyone. A fresh volley of shots jolted him back to the present. The robbers were mounting up their saddlebags, bulging. The leader tucked Mrs. Gable's locket into his pocket and swung into his saddle, his silver-inlaid pistol glinting as he holstered it. He gave a final dismissive glance at the terrorized town and spurred his horse, leading his men out of redemption as violently as they had arrived. Samuel's body screamed for him to act. The marshal in him, the husband in him, urged him to rise, to draw the Colt peacemaker he still wore out of habit, to unleash the vengeance he had carried for 10 years. But he remained kneeling, his knuckles white where he gripped the trough. His body was a cage of warring impulses. He was no longer a marshal. He was a ghost himself, a man living in the shadow of his greatest failure. To act now would be to admit that the past was not dead, that the man he used to be was not truly buried. As the thunder of hooves faded, leaving behind a wounded silence, Sheriff Thompson finally rose from his cover, his face grim. He looked across the street, and his eyes found Samuel's. For a long moment they stared at each other, an unspoken question hanging in the dusty air. Thompson knew who Samuel had been. He saw the coiled stillness in the man, the ghost of the lawman still lurking in his eyes. Samuel gave a slow, almost imperceptible shake of his head. He pushed himself to his feet, his joints aching with a weariness that had nothing to do with age. He turned away from the sheriff, away from the weeping Mrs. Gable, who was being helped to her feet, away from the scent of gunpowder that was the perfume of his former life. He walked back toward his wagon, the bag of flour forgotten. The locket, the silver-inlaid pistol, the leader's cold, cruel confidence. Coincidence was a fool's comfort. Something had broken loose inside him, a shard of the past, working its way to the surface. He had come to redemption, to be forgotten, to let the man he was die a quiet death. But as he climbed into his wagon and drove away from the violated town, he knew with a terrible certainty that the past had just found him. The ghost he had been hunting for a decade had just ridden through his sanctuary, and the quiet penance of Samuel Cross was about to end. The road to Samuel's ranch was a lonely artery, winding through the foothills, a path he had worn into the earth through years of solitary travel. His homestead was a fortress of isolation deliberately chosen for its distance from the world he had forsaken. The sun-bleached timbers of his cabin groaned under the weight of a solitude as vast as the plains themselves. Red dust, fine as powdered rust, settled on the windowsills like a layer of dried blood, a constant reminder of the unforgiving land he had made his warden. He unhitched the horse, the familiar ritual, a small anchor in the turbulent sea of his thoughts. The motions were automatic, the lifting of the harness, the lead to the trough, the rhythmic brush against the animal's flank. For 10 years this routine had been his prayer, a wordless catechism of survival. Work, eat, sleep, forget. Today the prayer felt hollow. The image of the locket was burned behind his eyes, a searing sigil of his failure. Inside the cabin was sparse and orderly, a reflection of the man who inhabited it. A single iron bedstead was pushed against one wall, a rough wool blanket folded with military precision at its foot. A stone hearth swept clean dominated the opposite wall. A sturdy table built by his own hands stood in the center of the room, with a single chair tucked beneath it. In a locked cupboard, a set of 3 other chairs and a full set of porcelain dishes lay shrouded in canvas relics of a life that felt like another man's dream. He had not opened that cupboard since the day he'd learned Sarah was gone. He moved to the small wash basin, splashing cold water on his face. The man who stared back from the sliver of cracked mirror was a stranger and an old friend. His face was a map of hard miles and harder sorrows, the lines around his eyes carved not by laughter, but by the relentless sun and the weight of memory. His hair was more gray than brown, his jaw set in a permanent line of grim endurance. But his eyes were the same. They were the clear, sharp gray of a hawk, and today they held a storm. His grief for Sarah was not the wild, untamed thing it had been in the first years. Time had weathered it into a quiet, disciplined penance. He did not speak her name aloud. He did not visit her grave back in the territory he'd fled. Instead, he honored her with silence, with order, with the lonely integrity of his life. He had failed to protect her. He had failed to avenge her. So he had retired from the world, believing he was no longer worthy of the badge, no longer fit to stand between the innocent and the predators who stalked the land. The robbery had shattered that self-imposed peace. It wasn't just the locket. It was the chilling familiarity of the leader's cruelty, the professional execution of the raid. It was the ghost of Jack the Ghost Corrigan and the leader of the Black Creek Raiders, a man so cunning he had left a trail of myths instead of clues. The next day, Samuel broke his routine. He rode back into Redemption not for supplies, but for information. The town was a hive of nervous energy. Men stood in tight clusters, voices low, rifles held with an unaccustomed readiness. Sheriff Thompson was in his office, a small stuffy room that smelled of stale coffee and ink. He looked up as Samuel entered, his expression weary but unsurprised. "Figured you'd be back," Thompson said, gesturing to a rickety chair. Samuel remained standing, the leader. "What do you know?" Thompson leaned back his chair, creaking in protest. "Not much. Came in fast, left clean. 4 men, maybe 5. Professional. One of my witnesses, young Jimmy from the livery, said the leader had a pistol with silver on the handle." He paused, studying Samuel's face. "Means something to you, doesn't it?" Samuel's expression was unreadable stone. "Maybe." "You know, Cross," Thompson said, his voice dropping, "a man with your experience. I could use the help, officially or otherwise." It was an offer of redemption, a chance to be the man he once was. But the shame of his failure was a heavy cloak. "I'm just a rancher now, Sheriff. I came to town for news, that's all." The lie was thin, and both men knew it. Samuel left the sheriff's office and made his way to Miller's General Store. The owner, Martha Miller, was a woman whose currency was gossip, and she was doing brisk business. A terrible thing, Samuel, just terrible. She said, her voice a conspiratorial whisper, as she weighed out a bag of beans he didn't need. They say the leader was a devil himself. Ripped the locket right from poor Eleanor Gable's neck. Said she fainted dead away after they rode off. And that new man, Mr. Kane, who's been buying up all that land south of the river, he was right there, saw the whole thing. Told the sheriff the leader had eyes like a snake. Samuel's head came up. Kane. Thomas Kane. Martha supplied eagerly. Rich as they come, they say. Just showed up a few months back with a pocket full of cash and started buying up parcels. Quiet man. Keeps to himself mostly. Lives in that old foreman's house on the Double Creek property with his daughter. A timid little thing she is. Samuel paid for the beans, his mind racing. A wealthy newcomer. It was a good way to lie low, to build a new life on a foundation of stolen gold. It was exactly the kind of move a man like Jack Corrigan would make. But it was a thread too thin to pull. A silver inlaid pistol and a stolen locket weren't enough. Not after 10 years of chasing shadows. He rode home the bag of beans, a leaden weight in his saddlebag. The mountains watched him, their peaks sharp against the sky, silent witnesses to his turmoil. He felt the pull of the past, the hunger for justice he had starved for a decade. But he also felt the deep, gutting fear of failing again. Sarah's memory deserved better than another failed attempt at vengeance. It deserved peace. He chose peace. For a week he forced himself back into the rhythm of his solitude. He mended fences, cleared brush, and spoke only to his horse. He fought to push the robbery from his mind, to rebury the marshal under the calloused hands of the rancher. He told himself it was a coincidence, a cruel trick of memory. He almost convinced himself. Then one night, as a storm gathered its breath in the mountains, a knock came at his door. It was not the firm, confident rap of a neighbor or the thunderous fist of a threat. It was a frantic, desperate tapping, small and weak, almost lost in the rising wind. Samuel rose slowly, a sense of unease prickling his skin. He pulled the latch and opened the door to the storm. There, caught in the flickering lantern light, stood a girl no more than 12. Her dress was a tattered rag, her hair a wild tangle of twigs and rain. Her face was bruised, one eye swollen shut, and her cheeks were streaked with dirt and tears. She looked up at him, her one good eye, wide with a terror so profound it seemed to steal the very air from her lungs. She was shaking not just from the cold, but from a fear that went bone deep. She didn't try to speak. She just stared at him, her small body braced for a blow or dismissal. Samuel stood frozen in the doorway, the wind whipping at his shirt. He looked past her into the howling darkness. No one. No parent following, no one searching. She was utterly alone. In her terrified gaze, he saw a reflection of every innocent soul he had ever sworn to protect. He saw the face of the world he had turned his back on. The choice to take her in was not a choice at all. It was a command from a part of himself he could no longer ignore. This was his chance to do what he couldn't do for his own family, to stand as a shield for the helpless. "Please," she finally whispered, her voice a raw, broken thing. "Just don't send me back." The words pierced the armor of his grief. He stepped back from the door, his voice rough but steady. "Come inside." The girl stumbled over the threshold, nearly collapsing. Samuel caught her arm, his touch gentle, and guided her to the lone chair at his table. The chair that had sat empty for 10 years. She sank into it, her eyes darting around the cabin, still expecting a trick, a trap. Samuel closed the door, shutting out the storm. But he knew with a certainty that chilled him to the core that he had just invited a far greater one in. Samuel moved with the deliberate calm of a man who understood that panic was a fire that consumed its host. He crouched to the girl's level, his weathered face softening as he took in the full extent of her state. The bruise on her cheek was fresh, a violent purple blooming under her pale freckled skin. A long, thin scratch ran from her temple to her jaw. She clutched the arms of the chair as if it were a life raft, her small knuckles white. "What's your name, child?" He asked, his voice low so as not to startle her. Her lips trembled. "Ruth," she whispered the name, a fragile puff of air. He nodded slowly. He didn't press for more. He could see the story in the lines of her body and the way she flinched when he moved too quickly. He rose and went to the hearth, adding another log to the fire. The flames leaped, casting warm, dancing shadows that pushed back the cabin's gloom. He filled a cup with water from the kettle and slid it across the table toward her. "You belong here tonight." He said the words, feeling foreign and momentous on his tongue. Ruth reached for the cup with both hands, bringing it to her lips with a tremor that threatened to spill its contents. She drank in small, desperate sips, her eyes never leaving him, watching him with the wariness of a cornered animal. For the first time in a decade, the silence in the cabin was not one of emptiness, but of anticipation. The storm outside raged its fury, a fitting soundtrack to the turmoil that had just crossed his threshold. Samuel knew this was only the beginning. A child didn't end up in this state on her own. Someone was responsible for the marks on her face, for the terror in her eyes. And that someone would likely come looking for what they considered their property. He didn't have to wait long. An hour later, as Ruth finally drifted into an exhausted sleep, curled in the chair with one of his old wool blankets wrapped around her, a new sound cut through the howl of the wind. It was the heavy, insistent pounding of a fist against his door. Ruth jolted awake, a small cry escaping her lips. Her eyes flew to the door wide with a familiar soul-deep dread. Samuel was already on his feet, his hand resting on the stock of the rifle he kept propped by the hearth. He gave Ruth a single steady look. "Stay behind me." The pounding came again, harder this time, accompanied by a voice that was not a shout, but a controlled, venomous command. "I know she's in there, Cross. Open this door." Samuel recognized the voice from Martha Miller's gossip. Thomas Kane, the wealthy newcomer, Ruth's father. He took a deep breath, steeling himself, and walked to the door. He didn't throw it open. He slid the latch with a deliberate click and pulled it inward just enough to block the entrance with his body. Thomas Kane stood on the porch, the lantern light, carving his features out of the stormy darkness. He was a handsome man, well-dressed even in the rain, his coat tailored and clean. But his face was a mask of cold, imperious anger. His eyes in particular held a chilling stillness, a predatory focus that made the hairs on Samuel's arms stand on end. They were the eyes from the bank robbery. Kane's gaze flickered past Samuel to where Ruth was huddled by the fire. A flicker of triumph, possessive and cruel, crossed his face. He then returned his attention to Samuel, a thin, condescending smile touching his lips. "Mr. Cross," he said, his voice a silken threat. "You are harboring my daughter. I suggest you return her to me before this becomes a matter for the law." He spoke with the articulate precision of an educated man, but the civility was a thin veneer over something rotten. "She came to my door, seeking shelter from the storm," Samuel said, his voice an even dangerous calm. "And from the look of her, the storm she was running from started in your house." Kane's smile tightened. "My daughter is difficult. She requires a firm hand. Discipline. Something a lonely man like you might not understand." He took a step forward, expecting Samuel to give way. Samuel didn't move. Behind Kane, two figures emerged from the gloom. One was a mountain of a man, his face a road map of old scars, his hands hanging at his sides like slabs of meat. The other was wiry and nervous, his eyes constantly darting from Kane to Samuel and back again. A man's home is his castle. Cross. Kane continued, his voice losing some of its polish, replaced by a raw edge of command. "And a man's child is his property. You, of all people, a former marshal, should understand the importance of order. Now step aside." The mention of his past sent a jolt through Samuel. Kane knew who he was. This wasn't just a random confrontation. "I understand order," Samuel replied, his hand moving from the doorframe to rest near the Colt at his hip. "I also understand cruelty. You'll not lay another hand on her." The nervous hired hand shifted his weight, muttering, "Maybe we should just go, Mr. Kane." The old man looked serious. The big man grunted a low rumble in his chest, but his eyes were fixed on Samuel's steady gaze, and he made no move. Kane's face contorted, the mask of civility finally slipping to reveal the raw fury beneath. "You have no right. She is my blood." "Blood doesn't give you the right to break her," Samuel shot back. He could feel Ruth trembling behind him, her fear a palpable thing in the small cabin. That fear stoked the embers of his old protective instincts into a blaze. Leave. Now. Or you'll find out just how little my hospitality extends to men like you. For a long, tense moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. The storm howled, the fire crackled, and the four men stood locked in a silent battle of wills. Cain's eyes narrowed into slits of pure hatred. He was measuring Samuel, calculating, and what he saw there, the unyielding resolve of a man with nothing left to lose, seemed to give him pause. Finally, he took a step back, a sneer twisting his lips. This is a mistake, Cross. A grave one. You've made an enemy tonight you cannot possibly comprehend. I will have her back. The law will see to it. He turned sharply, his expensive coat swirling around him, and strode back into the rain. The silent brute followed without a word. The nervous one cast one last frightened look at Samuel before scurrying after his employer. Their horses' hooves churned the mud as they rode away, swallowed by the darkness. Samuel closed the door, the click of the latch echoing in the sudden quiet. He leaned against the solid wood, his own hands trembling slightly with the receding adrenaline. He turned to look at Ruth. She was staring at him, her one good eye wide with a mixture of terror and dawning incredulous awe. No one had ever stood up to her father before. No one had ever dared. He'll come back, she whispered, her voice shaking. Samuel pushed himself off the door and knelt before her, placing his hands on her small, trembling shoulders. He looked directly into her eyes, forcing her to see the conviction in his own. I know, he said, and I'll be here when he does. In that moment, a silent pact was forged between the broken girl and the broken man. Samuel had given up on the world, but the world in the form of a battered child had just landed on his doorstep. And Thomas Cain, with his cold eyes and veiled threats, had not just threatened a child. He had awakened a sleeping giant. The marshal was not dead after all. He had just been given a new reason to fight. The days that followed were a fragile truce, a pocket of quiet before the inevitable next assault. Cain did not return immediately, and the silence was more menacing than his threats. Samuel knew men like Cain. They did not rely on brute force alone. They were patient predators who preferred to weaken their prey from a distance, to turn the world against them before moving in for the kill. Samuel used the time to prepare. The first front of Cain's war he knew would be fought not with fists, but with whispers. He rode into redemption, leaving Ruth safely locked in the cabin, with strict instructions not to open the door for anyone. The town was already buzzing. Cain had been busy. At Miller's General Store, Martha's usual warmth was replaced by a cool, cautious curiosity. Folks are talking, Samuel, she said, avoiding his eyes as she bagged his flour. Mr. Cain has been telling everyone you've taken his daughter, that you're a crazed old recluse grieving your wife, and that you've become confused. The poison was subtle and effective. He wasn't a kidnapper, not yet. He was a pitiable, potentially unstable man who had stolen a child out of loneliness and grief. It painted Cain as a concerned father and Samuel as a threat. Samuel's jaw tightened. And you, Martha, what do you believe? She flustered, her hands fluttering. Well, I've known you for years, Samuel. But he's a wealthy man, and he speaks so reasonably. The battle lines were being drawn. Cain was using his wealth and charm to isolate Samuel to make the town his ally. The next visit was to Sheriff Thompson. The sheriff looked haggard, a pile of paperwork on his desk that hadn't been there a week ago. He's filed a formal complaint, Cross Thompson said, rubbing his temples. And he's hired a lawyer from Denver. He's claiming you're an unfit guardian, that you're holding the girl against her will. He's building a legal case. I had to come out and question you officially." "You saw her face, Thompson," Samuel said, his voice low and tight. "You know what he is." "What I know and what a judge will believe are two different things." The sheriff countered, his frustration evident. Kane is painting a picture of a distraught father trying to rescue his daughter from a dangerous hermit. Without more proof of his abuse, his word and his money will carry the day. The pressure was mounting, a social and legal cage being built around him. Samuel returned to the ranch, the weight of the coming fight settling heavily on his shoulders. He found Ruth in the yard, trying to mimic the way he split wood with a small hatchet and a piece of kindling. She looked up as he approached, her face anxious. "Did they talk about me?" she asked. Samuel managed a reassuring look. "They talked. Doesn't mean we have to listen." He realized then that he couldn't just defend. He had to attack. Kane was a mystery, a man with a past hidden behind a wall of money. Samuel had to find the cracks in that wall. He began to use the skills he thought he'd left behind. He started spending his evenings not by the fire, but at his table, piecing together what little he knew. A wealthy man with no known history, a silver-inlaid pistol, cold, familiar eyes, a cruel streak masked by civility, and the locket from the bank robbery. He also began teaching Ruth, not just chores, but survival. He took her into the woods that bordered his land. "The world is bigger than a house and a yard," he told her, his voice patient. "You need to know how to read it." He taught her how to identify animal tracks, how to find north using the sun and the stars, how to tell which berries were safe to eat. He was giving her the tools to be strong, to be independent, to never be helpless again. During one of these lessons, as they sat by a creek watching a doe and her fawn, Ruth spoke of her father. "He keeps things locked up," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "In a big iron box under his bed. He told me never to touch it. He said it held his memories." Samuel's attention sharpened. "What kind of memories?" Ruth shrugged, her gaze distant. "I don't know. But once I saw him cleaning his pistol before he put it away. It was beautiful, shiny. It had silver flowers carved into the handle." The piece clicked into place, a cold, hard certainty. A silver-inlaid pistol just like the one the bank robber carried. The one that reminded him of the Black Creek Raiders. The escalating conflict came to a head a few days later. Samuel and Ruth were returning from the woods when they saw Kane's two hired hands near his fence line. They weren't trespassing, just standing there watching. The silent brute stared, his expression unreadable. The nervous one, whose name Samuel had learned was Silas, kept wringing his hands. It was a clear act of intimidation, a reminder that they were always there, just beyond his property. Samuel sent Ruth inside and walked calmly toward the fence. "Something I can help you with?" he asked, his voice deceptively mild. The big man just grunted. But Silas spoke, his words tumbling out. "Mr. Kane just wanted us to check the fences, make sure they're sound. He's a stickler for boundaries, you see." The subtext was clear. You have crossed a boundary. Samuel's eyes were like chips of granite. "Tell your boss my boundaries are just fine. And tell him that the next time he sends his dogs to sniff around my property, I might mistake them for wolves." Silas paled and practically dragged his larger companion away. But the threat had been delivered. Kane was closing in, using psychological warfare before he brought in the law. The final piece of the puzzle, the one that would reframe the entire conflict, fell into place that evening. Samuel was chopping wood for the night when he saw a wagon approaching. It was Sheriff Thompson, and he didn't look happy. Riding beside him was Thomas Kane. Cross Thompson said, his voice strained. Mr. Kane has a court order. It grants him the right to see his daughter. Right here, right now. Just to speak with her. I have to enforce it. Kane dismounted, a smug, triumphant look on his face. He strode toward the porch where Ruth had appeared, her face white with fear. Samuel moved to stand in front of her, a human shield. Hello, Ruth, Kane said, his voice dripping with false paternal affection. I've missed you. Ruth shrank behind Samuel, shaking her head. This is foolishness. Kane said, his eyes flicking to Samuel. She belongs with me. He took a step closer, raising his hand as if to gesture to her. As he did, his coat sleeve slid back an inch, revealing his wrist. And Samuel saw it. On the back of Kane's hand was a scar. A distinctive jagged white line that ran from his knuckle to his wrist, shaped vaguely like a lightning bolt. The world stopped. The sound of the wind and the sheriff's heavy breathing, Ruth's quiet terror, it all ceased. Samuel was thrown back 10 years to a dusty street fight in a forgotten town. He'd been a marshal closing in on the Black Creek Raiders. He'd had a run-in with one of them, a brutal fight that ended with Samuel's knife scoring a deep, ragged wound across the man's hand before he escaped into the shadows. He'd never seen the man's face clearly, but he remembered the scar he'd left. He had told his fellow marshals to look for a man with a lightning bolt on his hand. The man's name was Jack Corrigan. The locket from the robbery, the silver-inlaid pistol Ruth had described, the cold, predatory eyes, and now the scar. It wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't a trick of memory. Thomas Kane was Jack the Ghost Corrigan, the man who had murdered his wife, the man who had destroyed his life. The ruthless outlaw he had hunted and failed to catch was standing on his porch trying to take another child from him. The conflict transformed in a blinding flash. This was no longer a simple story of protection, a random act of kindness that had drawn him into a local dispute. This was a reckoning. His greatest failure, the source of his decade-long penance, had been delivered to his doorstep, wrapped in the guise of a wealthy landowner. The ghost from his past was made of flesh and blood, and he had just declared war on Samuel Cross for the second time. A cold, clarifying rage filled Samuel, burning away the last vestiges of the grieving rancher and reforging the U.S. Marshal in its flames. The revelation struck Samuel with the force of a physical blow, yet his face remained an unreadable mask of stone. Inside, his world had been upended. The blood roared in his ears, a tempest of decade-old fury and fresh burning hatred. Jack Corrigan, standing on his porch. The air grew thick, heavy with the weight of unspoken history. Every instinct screamed at Samuel to draw his Colt and end it right there, to deliver the justice he had been denied for 10 years. But he saw Ruth peeking out from behind him, her small face a canvas of fear, and he saw Sheriff Thompson, a man of the law, watching him intently. This couldn't be settled with a gunshot. Not yet. The game Corrigan was playing was more intricate than that. Corrigan, seemingly oblivious to the cataclysmic shift in Samuel's demeanor, pressed his advantage. His voice was laced with a parent's feigned concern, a performance for the sheriff's benefit. Ruth, darling, this has gone on long enough. Come with me. We can go home. Samuel's voice when he spoke was dangerously quiet. She is home. Corrigan's eyes narrowed, catching the new harder edge in Samuel's tone. The smugness on his face faltered for a fraction of a second, replaced by a flicker of sharp, analytical curiosity. He saw the change. He saw the marshal looking back at him. Sheriff Samuel said, his gaze never leaving Corrigan's. The court order says he can speak with her. He's spoken. Now get him off my land. Thompson, caught between the unyielding rancher and the man with the court order, hesitated. Cross, the order says he has a right to a private conversation. No, Ruth's small voice piped up from behind Samuel. It was quiet but firm. I don't want to talk to him. The simple defiance from the girl seemed to amuse Corrigan. He smiled a chilling, predatory expression that didn't reach his eyes. You see, Sheriff, the man has turned her against her own father. This is precisely the kind of poison I'm talking about. He took a deliberate step back, raising his hands in a gesture of surrender. Very well. I won't press the issue today. But know this, Cross, this only proves my case. I'll be back. And when I return, I'll have more than a piece of paper. I'll have the full weight of the law, of the... He mounted his horse, gave a curt nod to the sheriff, and rode away. His posture radiating a confidence that grated on Samuel's every nerve. Thompson lingered, his expression troubled. I don't like this, Cross, the sheriff admitted. Something about that man. It isn't right. But my hands are tied. He's working within the law. Sometimes the law is a shield for snakes, Samuel replied, his eyes still fixed on the dust cloud left by Corrigan's horse. After the sheriff departed, Samuel guided Ruth back inside. The girl was shaking, but there was a new spark of defiance in her eyes. I didn't want to talk to him, she repeated, as if trying to convince herself. You did right, Samuel assured her. But his mind was elsewhere, fitting the pieces of the puzzle together. Corrigan hadn't just stumbled into his life by chance. The move to redemption, the purchase of surrounding land, the public confrontation over Ruth, it was all too deliberate. This wasn't a coincidence. This was a plan. The confrontation that revealed the depth of Corrigan's depravity came a week later. Samuel had ridden into the foothills, checking his snares, when he saw a lone rider waiting for him on the trail. It was Corrigan. He was alone, his two hired hands, nowhere in sight. This was no accident. He had waited to find Samuel away from the ranch, away from witnesses. Corrigan sat calmly on his horse, his hands resting on the saddle horn. The silver-inlaid pistol was holstered at his hip. We meet at last, Marshal, he said, the title dripping with mockery. Or is it just Cross now? I must admit I was disappointed when you didn't recognize me sooner. I thought the scar might have jogged your memory. Samuel reined in his horse, his own hand hovering near his colt. The quiet fury inside him was a living thing, a cold, coiled snake ready to strike. Corrigan. Ah, he remembers, Corrigan said with a theatrical sigh. I was beginning to think that fire I'd heard so much about had finally gone out. It's a shame, really. The legend of Marshal Samuel Cross was quite something. The man who never gave up. The lawman who couldn't be bought. The husband who couldn't protect his wife. The final words were a deliberate, venomous jab. Samuel's knuckles turned white on his reins, but he held his composure. What do you want, Corrigan? Corrigan's smile was pure poison. What do I want? I want you to suffer, Cross. The same way I've suffered. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, filled with a hatred that had been simmering for years. You see, when you're a legend, you leave a wide wake. And sometimes people drown in it. People you never even think about. He paused, letting the words hang in the still air. 10 years ago, you led a posse after my gang. You were relentless, a force of nature. In the final shootout near Widow's Creek, a stray bullet from one of your men found its mark. It killed a boy. Just a boy, really. My younger brother, Danny. The name meant nothing to Samuel. He'd been in dozens of shootouts, seen countless men fall. He couldn't remember them all. You don't even remember him. Corrigan hissed, his composure cracking to reveal the raw, festering wound beneath. He was nothing to you. Just another outlaw. But he was my blood. My only family. And you took him from me. You with your righteous badge and your black and white view of the world. The truth of his plan, the scope of his revenge, became horrifyingly clear. When you disappeared after the incident at your ranch, Corrigan continued regaining his chilling calm. I was furious. You denied me my revenge. So I waited. I rebuilt myself. I took a new name, used the gold we'd stolen to become a respectable man. And I searched for you. It took years, but I finally found you here hiding in your own little purgatory. And I decided that just killing you would be too simple, too quick. I wanted to dismantle you first, the way you dismantled me. His eyes gleamed with a fanatic's light. I came to your town. I started buying the land around you, tightening the noose. I wanted to take away your peace, your solitude. And then fate delivered the perfect instrument into my hands. He chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. The girl. A child under your roof. A chance to show you what it feels like to have something you care for threatened. A chance to use your own code, your own law to destroy you. To turn the whole world against the great Samuel Cross and watch him break. Samuel stared at him, the sheer calculated evil of the plan taking his breath away. This wasn't just about revenge for a brother. This was the twisted obsession of a psychopath. Corrigan had orchestrated this entire drama, the torment of Ruth, the legal battles, the turning of the town, all as part of a long, elaborate game designed to shatter Samuel's soul before ending his life. You're insane, Samuel breathed. I'm methodical, Corrigan corrected him. I'm going to take the girl Cross. I'll win in court. The town will see you as a villain. And when you have nothing left, when you are well and truly alone again, I will kill you. And your precious Sarah will have company in the afterlife. The mention of Sarah's name was the final spark. The coiled snake inside Samuel struck. In a motion so fast, it was a blur. His Colt was in his hand. But Corrigan was just as quick. Their guns cleared leather. At the same instant, the hammers cocked, the two men locked in a deadly stalemate on the silent trail. Not here. Marshal Corrigan said, his smile unwavering, even with a gun pointed at his heart. Not like this. This game has a final act, and it will be played on my terms. With an almost casual air, he slowly, deliberately lowered his pistol and holstered it, never breaking eye contact. It was a gesture of supreme arrogance, a declaration that he was so in control of the situation that he didn't even fear Samuel's gun. Samuel's finger was tight on the trigger. He could end it now. A single motion and 10 years of pain would be over. But he knew Corrigan was right. Killing him here now would be murder. It would prove Kane's stories right. It would leave Ruth with no one branded as the ward of a killer. Corrigan had him trapped, not with ropes or bars, but with the very principles Samuel had lived his life by. Slowly, his jaw clenched so hard a muscle jumped in his cheek. Samuel lowered his Colt. Corrigan's smile widened. I knew you still had it in you. The honor? It's your greatest strength, Marshal. And it's the weapon I will use to destroy you. He tipped his hat, a gesture of mock respect, and turned his horse, cantering away down the trail, leaving Samuel alone in the suffocating silence, the taste of ash in his mouth. The fight for Ruth was no longer just about her safety. It was the final battleground in a war that had started a decade ago, a war for his past, his future, and his very soul. The final act of Corrigan's cruel play began with the sky. For days it had been a strange, bruised yellow, with the air heavy and still thick with a fine, gritty haze. A dust storm was coming, a monster gathering its strength on the plains. It was a fitting omen for the confrontation brewing in Redemption. Corrigan had made his move. Armed with depositions from paid witnesses and the full backing of a circuit judge he had undoubtedly bribed, he had secured a final binding court order. Sheriff Thompson had delivered the news to Samuel with the grim finality of a death sentence. It's an order of retrieval, Cross. He's been granted full and immediate custody. I'm ordered to assist him. If you resist, they'll issue a warrant for your arrest. He plans to take her tomorrow at noon in town. The location was deliberate. Corrigan wanted a public spectacle. He wanted to humiliate Samuel in front of the entire town, to have the law itself tear the girl from his arms. The night before the storm broke, the cabin was a fortress of silent tension. Samuel sat at the table cleaning his Colt with slow, methodical movements. Ruth sat by the hearth watching him, her small face pale and drawn. The bravado she had shown was gone, replaced by a quiet, heartbreaking resignation. "You can't win against the law, can you?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rising wind. Samuel stopped his work looking at the girl who had in a few short weeks become the center of his world. He had fought gangs, outlaws, and his own demons, but the thought of failing her was an agony beyond anything he had ever known. "The law is just a set of rules, Ruth," he said, his voice low and steady. "What matters is doing what's right. And tomorrow we're going to do what's right." He didn't know how, but he refused to surrender. Surrender meant giving her back to the man who murdered his wife. It was unthinkable. The morning of the storm, the world outside was a churning chaos of red dust and screaming wind. Visibility was reduced to a few yards. The sun was a pale, impotent disk behind the swirling grit. It was the perfect stage for a final desperate act. Samuel rode into redemption with Ruth sitting in front of him on the saddle, her small frame wrapped in his coat. He held her tight, a silent promise of protection against the storm, both natural and man-made. The town was a ghost town, its streets empty, its windows shuttered against the dust. The only sign of life was the saloon, its lanterns glowing weakly through the maelstrom. That was where Corrigan was waiting. Inside, the air was thick with smoke dust and the smell of stale whiskey. Corrigan stood at the bar, a drink in his hand, looking perfectly calm amidst the chaos. His two hired hands, the silent Brute and the nervous Silas, stood by the door. Sheriff Thompson was there, his face a mask of grim duty. A few townsfolk trapped by the storm huddled at tables, their eyes wide. Cross Corrigan said, his voice smooth as polished stone. "Right on time. I admire your punctuality." He held up the court order. "As you can see, this is all perfectly legal. The girl comes with me." Samuel dismounted Ruth from the horse just inside the saloon doors, shielding her from view. "This ends now, Corrigan." "Oh, I agree," Corrigan said with a smile. He took a step forward, his eyes locking on Ruth. "It's time to go home, little one." Ruth clung to Samuel's leg, her face buried in his pants. No. It was then that Corrigan played his final, most twisted card. He looked from Ruth to Samuel, a look of profound, theatrical sorrow on his face. "You see what he's done to her? Turned her against her own family, her own blood." He paused, letting the words sink in, and then delivered the secondary twist, a blow, designed to shatter Samuel's moral compass completely. "She is my blood, you know," Corrigan said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial hush. "But perhaps not in the way you think. You see, Ruth isn't my daughter." Samuel stared, his mind struggling to process the words. "She's my niece," Corrigan continued, his voice dripping with venomous satisfaction. "She's the daughter of my little brother, Danny, the boy your posse killed at Widow's Creek." The saloon fell silent, and the only sound the howling of the wind outside. The revelation was a stunning, sickening blow. Ruth was the last living piece of the brother whose death had fueled Corrigan's decade-long quest for revenge. After Danny died, Corrigan went on savoring every word. I took his girl in, raised her as my own, a constant living reminder of the debt you owed me. And yes, perhaps I was a little firm with her. Perhaps I let my grief color my judgment. But it was all for you, Cross. Every harsh word, every moment of fear she endured was a message intended for you. I've been torturing my own flesh and blood as a proxy for my hatred of you. The sheer monstrous evil of it was staggering. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about a level of depravity Samuel could barely comprehend. He looked down at Ruth, who was staring at Corrigan, her face a mess of confusion and dawning horror. He wasn't just saving an innocent child from an abusive father. He was trying to save the child whose family he had inadvertently helped destroy. The moral stakes had just been raised to an impossible height. Now, Corrigan said, holding out a hand, "Give me my niece." He was using the custody papers, the truth of her parentage, and Samuel's own guilt as a shield. The battle that followed was not a simple duel. It was a chaotic, strategic fight of wits and will, waged in the storm-swept, grit-filled confines of the saloon. Samuel shoved Ruth behind the bar, shouting, "Stay down." He overturned a heavy table, creating a makeshift barricade as Corrigan's men drew their guns. The saloon erupted into a pandemonium of splintering wood and shattering glass. The low visibility from the dust swirling in through the doors and broken windows made every shadow a potential threat. The silent brute charged a hulking shape in the gloom. Samuel, using his old marshal's instincts, didn't meet force with force. He sidestepped, using the man's momentum against him, sending him crashing through a window into the raging storm outside. Silas, the nervous one, fired wildly, his shots going high. Sheriff Thompson, his duty finally overridden by his conscience, drew his own weapon. "Drop it, Silas. It's over." Corrigan, meanwhile, vaulted over the bar, grabbing Ruth. He held her in front of him, the silver-inlaid pistol pressed to her head. "It's over when I say it is, Marshal." He snarled, his mask of calm finally gone, revealing the raw, desperate madman beneath. "You took my brother. Now I take his legacy. An eye for an eye." Samuel stood across the room, his own Colt steady in his hand, the two men facing each other through the swirling dust. Ruth was crying, her small body trembling in Corrigan's grasp. "Let her go, Corrigan." Samuel said, his voice a low, commanding growl. "This is between you and me. It always has been." "She is what's between you and me," Corrigan screamed back, his grip tightening on the girl. In that moment of high tension, a small, almost insignificant detail caught Samuel's eye. On the bar next to where Corrigan had been standing was his half-empty glass of whiskey and a small, polished silver object. Mrs. Gable's locket. He had taken it out to admire it, to gloat over his trophy. And in that moment of supreme arrogance, Corrigan had made his first mistake. "Ruth," Samuel said, his voice calm, but projecting clearly, "do you remember what I taught you about distractions?" Corrigan scoffed. What foolishness is this? But Ruth, her eyes wide, understood. With a sudden, desperate movement, she stomped down hard on Corrigan's instep with her small, sturdy boot. He roared in pain and surprise, his grip loosening for a fraction of a second. It was all Samuel needed. He didn't fire at Corrigan. He fired at the locket on the bar. The bullet struck the silver oval, sending it spinning into the air. The flash of metal in the dim light was an irresistible distraction. Corrigan's eyes and his gun flinched toward the movement for a barest instant. In that instant, Samuel moved. He lunged forward, not shooting, but tackling Corrigan, driving him away from Ruth. The two men crashed to the floor in a tangle of limbs. The pistol flew from Corrigan's hand, skittering across the dusty floorboards. The fight became primal, a desperate struggle of fists and fury. Sheriff Thompson was on them in a second, his pistol pressed to Corrigan's temple. "It's over, Kane, or whatever your name is." Corrigan lay panting on the floor, his face a mask of disbelief and defeated rage. The game was over. He had lost. Samuel pushed himself up, his body bruised, but his spirit unbroken. He went straight to Ruth, who was huddled behind the bar, and knelt before her, pulling her into his arms. She clung to him, sobbing, her small hands clutching his shirt as if she would never let go. The dust storm raged on outside, but inside the saloon the air was finally blessedly still. The law had captured the villain, but it was justice born of courage and a refusal to surrender that had truly won the day. As the dust settled both literally and figuratively, a profound quiet fell over the saloon. The howling of the wind outside seemed a distant echo of the chaos that had just passed. Sheriff Thompson had Jack Corrigan in irons, his face a mask of sullen, impotent fury. The great manipulator, the man who played with lives as if they were pieces on a board, was finally caged. Silas had surrendered without a fight, looking almost relieved. The townsfolk emerged from their hiding places, their faces a mixture of awe and shock. They stared at Samuel no longer as a crazed recluse, but as the protector he had proven himself to be. He ignored them. His world had shrunk to the small, trembling girl in his arms. He held Ruth close, murmuring words of comfort, his large hands stroking her hair until her shuddering sobs slowly subsided. Later, after Corrigan and Silas had been locked in the town's jail cells, Sheriff Thompson found Samuel and Ruth sitting in his office. The storm had begun to abate, and weak afternoon light filtered through the dusty window. Thompson cleared his throat, the sound loud in the quiet room. His real name is Jack Corrigan, the Ghost, leader of the Black Creek Raiders, wanted in 3 territories for robbery and murder. He shook his head in disbelief. He's been living under our noses this whole time. He looked at Samuel, his eyes filled with a new profound respect. The circuit judge is on his way back. When he hears the full story, your name will be cleared of everything. The town, they owe you an apology. I owe you one. Samuel just nodded, his gaze fixed on Ruth, who had fallen into an exhausted sleep against his shoulder. Just see that he never sees the light of day again, Sheriff. That's all the apology I need. The ride back to the ranch was quiet. The air was washed clean by the storm, and the world seemed new, fragile, and full of possibility. When they arrived, Samuel carried the sleeping girl inside and laid her gently on his bed, pulling the quilt up to her chin. For hours he sat in his chair, watching over her, the weight of the day, of the past 10 years, finally beginning to lift from his shoulders. The next morning, he found her sitting at the table, her small hands wrapped around a cup of water, her expression somber and thoughtful. She looked up as he approached. "Is it true?" she asked, her voice small. "Was he my uncle?" Samuel sat down opposite her, his heart aching at the burden she now had to carry. He knew that lies, no matter how well-intentioned, were a poison. She deserved the truth. "Yes," he said gently. "Your father was his younger brother, Danny. From what I can gather, he fell in with a bad crowd, with Corrigan. He died a long time ago, Ruth. None of what happened was your fault." Tears welled in her eyes. "So, my whole life, he was just using me." "He was a broken, hateful man," Samuel said, his voice firm but kind. "He tried to use his pain to break everyone around him. But he didn't break you, Ruth. You're stronger than he ever was." She looked at him, a flicker of that strength returning to her gaze. "Because you were here." The simple, profound truth of her words settled between them. They were 2 solitary souls who had found in each other the one thing they both desperately needed: a family. In the weeks that followed, a new rhythm established itself. Corrigan was tried and sentenced to life in prison. His land holdings were dissolved, his ill-gotten wealth seized. The town of Redemption, shamed by its willingness to believe a silver-tongued devil over a quiet, honorable man, reached out with tentative offers of help and friendship, which Samuel politely accepted but did not seek. His world was the ranch and the bright, resilient girl who was slowly healing within its borders. Ruth's laughter became a common sound in the once silent cabin. She learned to ride to read from the few books Samuel owned, to live without the constant shadow of fear. One crisp autumn evening, months after the storm, Samuel sat on the porch, watching the sun set, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small leather pouch. From it, he took a silver locket, oval-shaped, and etched with a single climbing rose. It was Sarah's. He had kept it hidden away, a sacred relic of a life he thought was over forever. Ruth came to sit beside him, leaning her head against his arm. They watched the last of the light fade in comfortable silence. Finally, Samuel turned to her. "I have something for you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. He held out the locket. Ruth looked at it, her eyes wide, recognizing it not as the one from the robbery, but as something far more precious. "This belonged to my wife, Sarah," Samuel said softly. "She would have wanted you to have it." He paused, his throat tight. "It's not a replacement for anything you've lost. It's a new beginning. For both of us." With trembling fingers, he unfastened the delicate chain and placed it around her neck. As the silver locket settled against her skin, it represented the closing of a painful chapter and the start of a new one. It was an emblem of forgiveness for the failures of his past and the wounds of hers. It was an act of acceptance of his new role as a father and hers as a daughter. It was the quiet, official founding of their new family, forged not by blood, but in the crucible of tragedy and choice. Ruth lifted her hand and touched the locket, her eyes shining with tears, but this time they were tears of gratitude and love. She looked up at Samuel, her smile as bright and hopeful as a sunrise. In that small, profound act of legacy, the lonely rancher and the lost girl found their peace. From the ashes of what had been stolen from them, and they had built something stronger, something true, something that would last. They had built a home